Hello, everyone. It's 2 o'clock now, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today, and welcome to our webinar on how to secure your online life. Over the next hour or so, our speakers will share and discuss key actionable tips and best practices to help you brush up on your cybersecurity basics and help you stay safe online. To start off, my name is Jennifer Cook. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at the National Cybersecurity Alliance. For those unfamiliar with the National Cybersecurity Alliance, we are the nation's leading nonprofit organization promoting cybersecurity education and awareness. Our mission is to empower a more secure, interconnected world, and we do this by creating and implementing broad-reaching education efforts with our partners in industry and government, academia as well, to empower individuals at home and work and school with the information they need to be safer and more secure online. I just want to take a moment to thank Verity IT for hosting us today. Verity IT is an industry-leading IT solutions provider, delivering IT support to small and mid-market businesses nationwide. They help create a worry-free IT experience by first taking the time to understand your business, then creating a plan for today's IT needs while preparing for tomorrow's growth and requirements. They specialize in managed IT services, cybersecurity, Microsoft 365, IT advisory, and cloud services. Verity IT strives to be thought leaders in the managed services industry and feel it's their duty to educate others on trending topics such as cybersecurity in order to help protect their local businesses from cyber criminals. One of the ways they go about helping educate those around them is by hosting monthly live and virtual events such as this panelist discussion. And before we get started, I'd just like to highlight that we're here today in honor of Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is an annual campaign hosted every October to ensure that everyone has the resources they need to be safer online. The National Cybersecurity Alliance hosts this campaign alongside our partners. And if you're interested in learning more and getting involved, you can follow us at the link on your screen, staysafeonline.org. So let's get started. I'm joined today by two great experts, Michael Fagan, computer scientist at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, also known as NIST, as well as James Lee, Chief Operating Officer at the Identity Theft Resource Center. Let's get started with a few introductions. Can you tell us a bit about yourselves and your organizations? We can start with you, Mike.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for having me here today, and I'm excited to talk about IoT as it pertains to securing your online digital life. I have some slides just to introduce NIST and myself a little bit. Originally, I had assembled a talk called the Cybersecurity and the Internet of Things without kind of the title of my remarks throughout the conversation today. As Jennifer mentioned, I'm a computer scientist with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I specifically work with the Cybersecurity for IoT program. Next slide, please. So as I talk today, I may mention in my slides or in my remarks specific products or technologies. It's meant in a demonstrative way, not meant to indicate a quality or not quality product in any way, shape, or form related to cybersecurity or otherwise. So my comments today on anything specific shouldn't be misconstrued as an endorsement or recommendation one way or the other by NIST. It's hard to talk about IoT without mentioning products. So next slide, please. A bit about NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, in case you don't know. We work to promote innovation and industrial competitiveness throughout the United States. Our main goal, avenue for driving that is measurement science. So a lot of the NIST labs outside of our lab in particular, so the physical measurement lab, for example, works internationally towards standardization of measurements, and they can work towards standards for scales and things like that. Our information technology lab works specifically to cultivate trust in information technology, which is less easy to measure sometimes. So our work is a bit more guidance oriented and policy oriented, especially the work I do in the what's called the Applied Cybersecurity Division. Our ITL's priority areas are cybersecurity, the Internet of Things, as well as artificial intelligence, reliable computing, and future computing technologies. But my remarks today will cover those first two areas. NIST has a lot of roles within the federal government, but in general, we produce useful information for the public in the form of reports and just sort of scientific reports, but also some of the kinds of reports I'll discuss a bit today. We're within the Department of Commerce as well. Next slide, please. And finally, just a little bit about our group very quickly. With the Cybersecurity for IoT program, we were pulled together to work in the area of how cybersecurity may be different for IoT. So in our very onset, the team, even before my time, honestly, identified these 5 guiding principles that stand to this day, based on NIST's own principles, ITL's principles, and ACD's principles, but also, the way we understand the IoT marketplace. So things move very quickly, of course. So stakeholder engagement and an outcome-based approach are both very important in our work. We have to understand that it's an ecosystem of things. I'll talk a lot about IoT products, individual devices today, but there's more behind it, and I'll get a little bit into that maybe as well. We have to understand the risks related to these products and how to fix those. But IoT is very different things do different things, as I'll highlight. Different products will have, of course, different functionalities, and that will have different implications for what's appropriate in terms of cybersecurity. So our work, we can't say what one size will fit all, but we can give good guidance that can apply in many cases. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you for having me, and I look forward to the discussion and all the specific topics we'll be getting into.
Great, thank you. And James, can you tell us a bit about yourself and the Identity Theft Resource Center?
Sure, and thanks for inviting me to join you today. The ITRC has been around for a little over 21 years. Our core mission is to provide assistance to the victims of identity crimes for no charge. So free assistance to identity crime victims, as well as helping people prevent themselves from becoming identity crime victims. So that's our core mission. And we work with, round numbers, a little over 11,000 individuals per year. They tend to be the more difficult and complex kinds of identity crimes that make their way to us. We also provide education tools through our website, where we have a little more than 1 million people come to us each year for assistance that way. Since 2005, we've also built the largest repository of data breach information in the US. So if there has been a publicly reported data breach since that time, it's in our database, and we analyze that. We publish reports, and since 2020, we have started offering business services for low cost to help businesses track data breaches for purposes of their own strategic planning, for their security planning, for due diligence, so they can ensure that the people that they're doing business with have proper cybersecurity, and if they say they've not had a data breach, they could actually back that up. So we do offer services for businesses that are low cost as well in the areas of training and prevention. So that's the ITRC. Our partners include the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, the IRS, as well as larger organizations that are household names as well. My background personally is in operations, primarily in data analytics and in cybersecurity. Although once upon a time I did work in state government, and I even worked in the pulp and paper industry for a number of years as well. So I traded a 2,000-year-old industry for the latest and greatest kinds of technology.
Great, thank you. So let's, I guess, start by setting the scene a bit. Cybersecurity attacks, they've been in the news a lot recently. There have been numerous high-profile attacks, and each one kind of seems to be getting bigger than the last. I was wondering if, James, maybe we can start with you. Can you kind of give us an overview of the kind of threats that we're seeing and what today's landscape looks like?
Sure. And I've got a slide there if you want to pull that up. This is just to sort of illustrate where we are today, because the threat actors are constantly changing, although their tactics have become far more sophisticated, far more organized, and they are still aimed at collecting consumer information, but the real target is businesses today. That hasn't always been the case. And there's, we can divide the threat actors into two basic groups: those that just want to make money, and those that are in some way affiliated with a nation state, and they tend to be more in the intelligence gathering and the espionage business. And that tends to be the smaller component. Most of the attacks that we see today are financially motivated. And what they want to do is they want to collect information that they can monetize. Now, historically, they did that by hoovering up as much information as they possibly could, either by attacking an organization, and they may do that in a number of ways. They would inject some form of malware, or they would have some sort of low-level kind of social engineering. But it was really about just accumulating mass amounts of information. Today, though, they're being highly targeted. They're still collecting that information, but it's not that they want everything they can get now. They're looking for very specific kinds of information. And some of that's what you see on the screen here is what we're seeing in terms of cyber attacks is they want access to corporate systems, and corporate systems may be everything from a mom and pop corner store all the way to the largest organizations in the country and indeed around the world. So they want that information that's very specific that they can turn around then and monetize. They can sell it. And that is today primarily two things: your login and your password. And I know we're going to get to talking a little bit more about those two things later on in this conversation, but that really is the holy grail today. So if you look at this list of items on here, we're trained almost at this point to think of the thing I have to protect most in the world is my social security number. When, as you can see there on the price list, this comes from one of the online identity marketplaces that identity thieves use. The social security number is the least valuable piece of information that they sell today. Your Gmail account is far more valuable than your social security number. And we can talk about that later on. But from what we're seeing attacks at this point is the threat actors they're more organized, they're more sophisticated, the attacks are more sophisticated, they're more narrow, but they're more damaging. And they're looking for information either to monetize by directly collecting that information, or through a ransomware attack where they hold the data hostage and then and get paid to release the information. That information may never make it into the wild, but it's still the data that they're holding on to be able to monetize that.
Great. And Michael, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so definitely the identity theft angle on the threats, the individualization from securing your digital life. Here, har, har. We have to. There's a certain role we all play that's maybe out of our control. How these things end up on the dark web. We can take certain actions to keep that from happening. We can avoid additional attacks and take mitigations on our own. But some aspects of the threats are certainly out of individuals' control, but can still impact us. So in IoT, we think a lot about both of these. I think there's the obvious impacts of IoT, and these are, I'll admittedly say, you see big headlines sometimes about these, but it happening other than, baby cameras or other kinds of cameras not having enough security and being able to be assembled on dark web pages for anyone to view the streams of. That's certainly a known attack that has happened. But those kinds of operational faults um, are smaller compared to the, I think, indirect impacts of some IoT cybersecurity threats. I'm mainly thinking of DDoS botnets that can assemble large numbers of IoT devices, may be in our homes, due to poor security posture by maybe us, but also possibly the manufacturers themselves or third parties as well. And um, with the same kind of motivation that James mentioned, this financial aspect where there's money to be made, those botnets are then used in essentially large scale extortion schemes where that's the muscle. The large botnet is a crowdsourced muscle that can put pressure on large organizations to pay a ransom, a different kind of ransomware in this case than what we normally hear about, to avoid being essentially taken down. This may not impact us always directly, but sometimes it does. And it seems inconsequential sometimes, when you mention it, but outages of popular websites are sometimes caused by this kind of attack. You can't access Netflix, but it could also be something much more sinister. Folks can't access the EHR system at a hospital because the hospital is being DDoSed. Folks can't access their medical records at home even. Can cause issues, of course. Connections are important these days. And so that it can impact all of us, and NIST's mission is to obviously protect the nation overall. And so we think about this when it comes to IoT as well. And the motivation is different. It's the reason why I bring this up in the context of what James talked about. I think there's, we all want to protect our own personal information, our own personal data. But how what's in our own homes can impact the rest of the world. Sometimes it's a little bit mismatched on the incentives there. So that's where I mentioned maybe there's others who are responsible than personal responsibility, because it's harder to understand the damage that could be done by my device sitting next to me here being part of a DDoS botnet, as opposed to my Gmail account can be bought for $80 on the web. So yeah, a lot of the work that I'll talk about later, sort of the mitigation side of it, was really motivated by that threat mainly. I'll admit, back in the it's called Mirai. Back in those days, our team was really spun up in response to that, and there have been more, additional botnets since, and Mirai's still around. So this is a consistent challenge in IoT to this day.
Great. And going off of what you both are saying, understanding there's certainly a lot in cybersecurity that's out of an individual's control. Let's talk about what is within our control, just kind of on a personal level. Why is it important for individuals to understand cybersecurity? And maybe we can talk about just some of the aspects of cybersecurity that are important to understand, whether it comes to our our personal lives, our work lives, our family lives. James, would you like to start?
Sure. Because I'm so shy and retiring. You have to prompt me to talk. I think building a little bit on what Mike just said too, there's this level of interconnectivity that we might think of. The only thing that's being impacted is the device that I talk to on my bedside to give me, what's the weather today, or play NPR. Wait, don't tell me. We think that that's the only impact, when in fact those are massively interconnected devices, and it connects our personal life and our work life and our community life all together. So it's important that we approach these things with the understanding that I can do something that not only helps protect me, but I'm also protecting my family, my workplace, and my community when I follow some pretty simple, basic best practices. Now, there's a lot of things that an individual, you can't stop from happening. I can't stop somebody from infiltrating my financial institution. As much as I would hate that to happen, there's not anything I can do about that. What I can do, though, is make sure that I have all the protections in place on my side, and I follow best practices So I'll quit talking in code and give some examples here. Something as simple as making sure you have a strong password and you have a different password on every account that you have. Now, that sounds kind of cumbersome, but there are tools to help you do that. But that is one of the best ways that if your information ever does get out into the wild, you can limit the damage, because one password doesn't give you the keys to every account that you have. And we know that most people actually reuse the same password. Depending upon who you talk to, whether it's Google or Microsoft or some other entity, they will tell you somewhere between 80 and 95% of people reuse the same password on every account. And that just helps the bad guys be able to commit these kinds of cyber attacks. They don't have to break into a system. They can walk right through with a valid email and password and go right into the system to do whatever damage that they were intended to doing in the first place. So that's something that's very basic that everybody can do, that actually has a great ripple effect and a force multiplier. If everybody just followed better password protocols, we would see fewer attacks, fewer successful attacks.
And also talking about, using passwords and kind of, best practices for account management. Sometimes you see conflicting advice online, like, either recommending changing your password or, creating a password with 24 characters, or just using multi-factor authentication and focusing on that instead. Do you have any recommendations for really what the, best forms of account management are?
I'm sure my friend down here is going to have some too, because I think NIST probably has a guideline or two around this. But I'll give you the answer that we give people. First of all, these kinds of best practices are just that. They're a practice, and they change because circumstances change, and the tactics of the people who are trying to steal your information, they change those tactics. So what was valid advice maybe even 6 months ago may not be valid advice today. So it does require you to be flexible in a lot of senses. So yeah, once upon a time, when we first started getting passwords, which hasn't been that long ago, when you first started getting passwords, 6 characters was all you needed, and you could name it after your dog and you were fine. That's obviously not the case anymore. But a year ago, we would tell you that you had to have uppercase, lowercase, number, symbol, stand on your head, scratch your ear, and all at the same time, and then that was the greatest password in the world. Today, we would tell you, no, it's about length. And when you bring in human behavior, just the fact that we're human beings and we're creatures of habit. If I have a long password that I can remember, and I have a unique password on every account, that is better than the complex kind of passwords that nobody could remember. Because what happened when we went to that password schema? Everybody started using the same password on every account because they couldn't remember them, and it became inconvenient. So we were actually, giving people a reverse incentive to develop a bad habit. So let's fast forward. Now we would tell you 12 characters or longer is better. Use a quote. It can be a movie title. It can be a song lyric. It can be a quote from Shakespeare, as long as it's long and you can remember it. Because a 12 character, no uppercase, no lowercase, a 12 character password will take 300 years for an automated tool that threat actors use to figure out your password. If they're just trying to do a brute force attack, it's going to take them far longer than you'll live to breach that password. So that means they're not going to try because they don't have that kind of patience. So, let's look at that as a best practice. It's about length. Changing it frequently doesn't matter that much either. I mean, if you want to do it, that's great. But the core thing we have to have people do today is longer passwords that are memorable and unique per account. It's that unique per account where most people get into trouble. But that's why we now have password managers, apps that help you keep track of all of that. We have apps that will generate those passwords for you and then keep track of them. And even now in the modern browsers, so in Safari, in Mozilla Firefox, in Chrome, there are tools within that to help you as well. And we can talk about the good and the bad of that, but the fact is there are tools to help you remember your passwords that we didn't have before.
And Michael, what about you?
Completely agree with that advice. Yeah, there's been a shift. I think a lot of folks who might consider themselves in tune to this area would probably think, yeah, as random, and the long part I think has stood, but that human understandability part, that I think there was less understanding. Essentially it boils down to randomness. And most attacks are really based around no lack of additional information. There was a lot of, that was why the worry, he mentioned it. Your dog's name was okay. Not anymore, because it's easy enough on Facebook to figure out your dog's name and try that. That's a bit of a targeted attack, even using your dog's name, right? And so your dog's name could be a component of the password. It's about it being random enough and long enough. And, if it's just your dog's name over and over, that's not so great. But if it's your dog's name and then another word and then a quote, each additional, each word is going to add 6 characters, 4 characters at least. And you're very quickly getting up to, like James mentioned, a length that is going to be from your most common attempt at cracking a password, especially if it's just based on some sort of data dump that was hacked and you're not the individual target of the attack. It's, your data just gets whipped up in one of these big breaches, and there's, folks sitting around just trying to get into as many accounts as they can to do whatever they can do. In that case, it's really, like James mentioned, the length is going to thwart that attack, because that individual might not even have any additional information as to whose account this is attached to, other than it's from some website. So them doing additional research and trying to guess, okay, well, we know they use a quote and we know their favorite movie is this, and so maybe a few quotes from that movie, and oh, look, we're in, like your friend might be able to do. And that's, I think, where a lot of the thinking came from back in the day, to avoid that kind of predictability. But from a machine guessing standpoint, which is what James is highlighting, and this realizes and agrees, characters are characters. So, in my prior work for my PhD, I focused on partly related to passwords, usability aspects of them. And that is a growing consideration these days, and a big part of why this guidance has shifted a little bit. It's really more human-centric as opposed to strict security-centric, because in theory, it would be better to just have truly, just total gibberish, so no one could guess it at all without having to go brute force. There would be no espionage that could happen, then, which is the thought, right? But the espionage case adds a layer of security that's unrealistically needed for most average users, right? And it makes it complicated for an average user, just regular people, when I say that, even myself included, to manage the task. Like we're all CIA agents keeping these, people spying on us and looking over our shoulder away, which is truly how that was presented, right? Shoulder surfing, we don't have to worry about that and all that, which is true, but only within a certain degree, right? Like, I think we don't have to fear the person on the Wi-Fi at the Starbucks always. There's still security to be had, to James' point. And to just go back to that last question about, in this idea of, individual, what can we do to be more secure? We would call that access control, right? Having good, strong passwords, the way we've described them, and should be manageable for most people. Another thing that's changed over time, that's a real good practice for security, kind of hits the other side of it, which is what we would call, if you were doing it in your business, is vulnerability management, which is applying software updates when they apply, patches, whatever you want to call them, right? That's also similarly gotten easier over time. Back in my PhD research days 10 years ago, a big question was, how do you get people to click yes on the notification box? Do you even see notification boxes for updates anymore? No, because it's all moved to automatic, because the updates have become so incremental that the probability of damage seems to have gone down, right? Like updates come daily for some programs, like your browser, and those incremental changes, sure, it could break something, could break an extension here or there, but in the past, right, those operating system updates we were thinking about, those are huge, gigabytes possibly of new code. It could break a lot in a lot of systems. And so the need for a user input on that opt-in for that huge of a change was very necessary from a operational standpoint for many kinds of users, even average people. But nowadays, even our operating systems, everything's cloud-based, everything's always connected. The interconnectivity also allows for security to be delivered in a more user-friendly way. This is another great example where basically all I could recommend in this case is if you get a message to update, you should apply that update unless you have an understood reason why you're not updating the software and you've taken other mitigations, of course. But in most cases, I would say make sure you have updates turned on, because that's how it works. You make sure you're opt-in or you're not opted out. Ideally, it's just something that's automatic and it's happening. And taking the time to check to make sure updates are coming in, that's good practice too. But beyond that, ideally, you shouldn't have to do much more in this case. But that is definitely another way to keep yourself safe on whatever device you're using, IoT or otherwise.
Great. And I'd like to talk a bit, James, about the work that you're doing at ITRC on identity theft. I think this is something in particular a lot of people think about when it comes to staying safe online and cybersecurity. What kind of trends are you seeing around identity theft, or are there any particular instances that lead to somebody becoming a victim of identity theft?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, a little bit of this is back to what we were talking about earlier, that the tactics of the bad guys have changed quite a bit. We're no longer seeing the mass accumulation of data the way we did even 5 years ago, when it really was a numbers game. How much data can I collect on how many people all at the same time? That was the name of the game. But they've become more sophisticated. They're very good at it. And basically, the bad guys today, these organized cyber criminal groups who specialize in a particular kind of cybercrime, they're organized just like businesses. They are structured like businesses and they operate like business. And the larger ones are approaching, if not already there, multi-billion-dollar annual revenue status. So it is a very different kind of a threat environment than what we've lived in historically. If you want to go ahead and pull up the next set of slides, just sort of set the table here a little bit of why people should care about it. One is we're kind of complacent. We've kind of gotten used to seeing those data breach notices or the news headlines or whatever. We've all kind of resigned ourselves that my information's out there and there's not anything I can do about it. So why would I even try? And that's a very dangerous position to take. We also we're in an environment where data is the coin of the realm. It is the fuel that drives the economy in many respects today. And so much of the time we're told that we get free this and free that, but it actually is coming with a cost, and that cost is providing personal information, providing data. There's been a lot of discussion around in the last year because of some of the things that the major tech companies have done around tracking, and plus some privacy regulations in Europe that are driving regulations now here in the US around tracking the information of individuals. So you're not being paranoid. Yes, you are being tracked. The trick is, do you know about it? And that's a policy decision, and it's being addressed at the state level in the US. But here's this last one that's very important as sort of setting the stage around the question of identity theft and should you be afraid and what you should do to protect yourself, is this concept of oversharing and how that relates to data breaches. Mike referred to it here a second ago about how there may be data that around your password. If you know your dog's name, there may be other pieces of data that they can accumulate to guess certain parts about your life or to assume your identity. And much of that comes from the fact that we are now all accustomed to sharing on social media. And there's a lot of oversharing that has fueled identity fraud. A little bit different from identity theft. Theft is when you steal the information. Fraud is when you use it. And we've gone from a period for the first 15 years of this phenomena of identity theft that accumulated information. Now we are entering the era of identity fraud, where all that information is being used to commit cyber crimes. Let's move on to the next one, and we'll talk specifically about what's happening. So this is data from the first half of this year. So this is through June 30 this year. Actually, next week, we're going to update this again. We'll have the third quarter information about data breaches in the United States. So you can tell here that there are 410 data breaches that were a result of cyber attacks just in the second quarter of 2021. There are almost 900 through the first 6 months of the year. That's 52 million people impacted. Now, in the great scheme of things, that's actually a low number, where we've seen, literally 4 or 5 years ago, we were talking about the number of individuals being impacted in the billions. Not that there's that many billion people in the United States, but so many people were being hit multiple times per year for a period of time. It literally equated into billions of individuals impacted. And the second, and you see within that, phishing, that is the thing that most people are going to encounter personally. And you see it now. You get those emails that from, it's not your bank, but you get it says that your bank account has been suspended, or you get an email that looks like it's from Microsoft or Amazon or Apple, and it looks real. It looks letter perfect. Well, those are phishing attempts. And what they really want you to do is to log in to your account with those legitimate organizations so they can steal your password and your login, which is typically your email address. So you see that that's very prevalent. We're now seeing a dramatic rise at the ITRC and breaches caused by this. Now, sometimes it's data theft. Increasingly, you see the letters BEC, business email compromise. That's when a business is the target. It may go to an employee. The email may go to an employee, or a text may go to an employee. They click on it. Maybe it opens up malware, or maybe it looks like it's an email from the CEO saying, pay this company this amount of money, and here's their banking information, and can you get that out today? So that's a $1.8 billion a year problem in the United States, according to the FBI. And then you see ransomware, and you see that goes on down. So we're seeing actually, up until this year, we were trending down and had been trending down for the last several years. We've trended back up this year. It's not quite a hockey stick, but it's pretty close. And we'll reveal the actual numbers next week. But we have already, in the first 8 months of this year, didn't even take us 9 months, in the first 8 months of this year, we surpassed the total number of data breaches last year. So we're going to be much higher than we were last year. And it's conceivable that we could set an all-time high record this year. Now, here's the interesting thing about that. There's actually fewer people impacted. So the number of individuals being impacted has actually been going down, while the number of cyber attacks and the number of data breaches has been going up. Why? Because they're being highly targeted about the organizations they're attacking, how they attack them, and what they want when they get there. So it's resulted in fewer individuals being directly impacted. And that's probably the environment where we're going to be in for a while, along with there is this, again, we talked about this concept of identity fraud versus identity theft. There's a part of identity fraud that's directly relates to scams and scams that use your identity. We had, during the pandemic, because of the unemployment benefit, the enhancements that were offered through the federal government, we had an explosion of identity fraud in unemployment, where people would impersonate somebody who they may be unemployed, they may not be, but they would apply for unemployment benefits in that individual's name using stolen logins and passwords, and then the other information that might be available around them so they could prove that they were a given individual. Depending upon who you talk to, even the government says the problem is somewhere around $100 billion in fraud. There are private sector groups who have been working on this and say it could be as high as $400 billion in fraud directly related to identity unemployment benefits. And so that's what is happening in the general marketplace around identity theft, is we're seeing all that accumulated data now being used to commit fraud.
And what should someone do if they find out their data has been compromised in a breach, or if somebody's using their name and committing identity fraud? What should they do next?
Yeah. Well, if you know that you have been impacted by a breach, and we always resisted for years referring to people who are impacted by breaches as victims, but the reality is they are victims now. We're seeing how this is playing out. So we now actually refer to breach and people whose information was breached as victims. You're a victim of an identity compromise. If you get a letter, follow that letter. We know from research that most people don't. Most people don't even remember that they ever got a letter. And people who have been impacted by multiple breaches, which is just about everybody with a pulse, have no idea that they've been hit more than one time. So, there's a lot of work going on in various parts of the nonprofit world, the for-profit world, the government, looking at how we can be more effective in helping people realize they've been breached. So when you get that letter, do what it says. It's probably going to say that you should sign up for some form of identity remediation. Maybe it's going to be credit monitoring. Maybe it's going to be other restoration services. You should do that. Here's the single most important thing you should do. Freeze your credit. Don't put a credit alert. Don't sign up for credit monitoring. Freeze your credit. That is the only way to ensure that no one opens a new account in your name if it requires a credit check. If it requires a credit check and you have a credit freeze, then you're protected. You have to go to each bureau, each credit bureau individually, or there is an organization, it's a nonprofit, frozenpie.org, frozen and PII.org, where it's a one-stop shop. You can go there and you can freeze your credit at all three of the credit bureaus. But that is the single most important thing you could do in that circumstance to protect something from happening in the future. There's not much you can do about what has happened in the past. Credit monitoring is a great thing to give you peace of mind, and there are a lot of other uses for it, but it doesn't prevent anything. It tells you that the horse has left the barn. It doesn't keep the horse from leaving. So that's the main thing is that. Second is change your passwords, and don't just change it on the account that was breached. If you've used the same account on multiple accounts, back to what we just talked about, one password per account. Same thing for PINs. Don't use the same PIN number on every account that you have, because if that gets breached, same issue you have with it, you have the same password on every account. So if a PIN was involved in a breach, make sure you change the PINs on your various accounts that you use the same PIN. Those two things are relatively simple things to do. They may be a little more time consuming than you'd like them to be, but the payoff is in the future, you'll be far more secure. Oh, the last thing, let me add one more thing. Multi-factor authentication, but multi-factor authentication with an app. Now that's not offered for every kind of account that has multi-factor authentication. So if you have to go with that and use the text where the code is text to you or emailed, that's better than nothing. but that is still vulnerable to a degree. But the app-based multi-factor authentication is a superior way, and you should use that if it's available to you. And if it's not, you should ask your whoever it is that you have an account with, you ask them why don't they have it.
That's a good point. And I'd like to talk about, some of these best practices as they relate to connected devices. And Mike, maybe you can talk about, some of what you're seeing around, not only our connected laptops and phones, but the other devices we bring into our homes, like, our smart TVs, our home speakers. What are those other vulnerabilities we should look out for? And, what are some of those best practices?
Sure. Yeah, I have some slides I can talk to for this one. If we can pull up that first one there. Yeah, just kind of what is IoT, right? You mentioned laptop, smartphone. There are other kinds of devices. Even I think, well, there are devices that predate IoT as we understand it, that are pretty much IoT. A printer is a good example. Smart TVs on the cusp of, I think they were around technically before IoT was a thing, but I think are pretty squarely considered IoT these days. Also includes, of course, appliances of all sorts, but also, water sensors that are used in industrial settings, all sorts of whiz-bang products that help assembly lines and enterprises execute on their missions. But when you get down to nuts and bolts, we consider an IoT, something that has one transducer, which means it interacts with the physical world either by sensing it and or by changing it. So the TV changes your physical world, right? It can create the pictures on the screen and all. A light bulb changes the physical world by illuminating it. The fridge cools your food, oven cooks it. Or they could be, and many times it's both, or they could be more sensor oriented, something that is detecting the, movement in the room, something that might be looking for certain gestures to be able to send a command for another device to actuate. And then the other key there, because those sorts of things, right, of course, all existed in the analog world. It's this digitalization of it, particularly the interoperability aspect that James mentioned. It can connect to other things, aka through the internet in most cases, or maybe just among its little mini system. But a lot of times, and especially when we're thinking about cybersecurity, we're thinking about things that are connecting up to very large networks and possibly to the internet overall. So with that in mind, to your question, Jennifer, there is a lot to think about that is even different than what we're kind of just throwing around here as good practice, right? If you go to the next slide, these devices are very different and produce unique challenges for cybersecurity and privacy that are very much related on a technical level and might have very similar causes as traditional cybersecurity challenges, but the approaches may be different, and sometimes even the causes are different because it's maybe form factor, right? You could only fit a number pad on the device instead of a full keyboard, so passwords have to be numerical, or it's too much to encode in the mind, right? We could do something with the ABC, but it doesn't really help it anyway. So that limits the number of characters. It makes guessability a lot harder. It makes our guidance moot about how you come up with a password for that kind of device. That's not an insurmountable challenge for most individuals, you'd figure, but it's one that now they're kind of like on their own in this individual case, right? Like you don't have a best practice that is applicable from this conversation if the device doesn't accept a password that's long enough to be safe. That's another thing, right? Like sometimes the devices themselves have limitations that, frankly, they can only be overcome so much. So next slide, please. And like I was mentioning, how we use them and how we rely on them is going to be very different. And it can increase the impact in some ways and decrease the impact in other ways of a cybersecurity event in your home. So, if my laptop were to suddenly be attacked and freeze up right now, it would be a problem. It would stop me from being able to work, and I might have other things I need to do with the laptop. If my Nest is locked down, sure, I can keep working as long as my home stays an appropriate temperature. It's a very specific impact with IoT sometimes, but that specific impact could be incredibly critical to the broader, this physical world impact. It could impact the broader customer in different ways. And then if it's the sensor impact, it could have significant impact on the broader system, decisions that are being made about all sorts of things. And in the industrial case, this becomes particularly concerning. Next slide, please. And then I highlighted it, but the constraints of an IoT device may be significant. And I think bringing up, the dog collar here, it's a good example, right? There's no interface on that other than these lights, these two lights that you can see maybe. And it might have some sort of speaker and maybe a microphone built into it. But that's all. You can't, how do you encrypt, how do I make sure somebody can't hear my password if I need to authenticate with my voice? In reality, this device will probably use a mobile app or something like that to augment its interface. That brings its own set of considerations and cybersecurity that, you shouldn't have to think too much about as the end user, but it really complicates some of the best practices for IoT sometimes. Where you apply these best practices may be less direct. And I think the printers are a good example, right? Like a lot of our security practices very well might need to protect the printer, but it's hard to apply them because the printer doesn't work the same way. IoT, this comes up a lot. Next slide, please. And then, this one does impact, I'd say, end users here. All this advice we give is all well and good if you know you're talking to a computer, if you know you're using a computer. And IoT, increases the possibility, at least, that you're not even aware you need to think about these things. As products become smart in different ways, for example, we may start to do things similarly as technologies become cheaper and are used in different ways that may decrease or increase our sensitivity to whether or not something is a connected product. What I mean by that is, right, like I think the fact that you use an app to connect to your fridge probably be indicative that it's a smart fridge. I pulling the doors open might not know that, but the owner at least could, right? But much like things become standardized in other ways, maybe even for a quote dumb fridge, there's some app component that we're going to use locally, right, through some near frequency communication to do something. It's possible in the near future, right? That sort of change, which in some cases that does exist, right? Cars, right? My car isn't my personal car is not nearly as connected as many cars, but it does have an app that brings certain cybersecurity considerations. But is my car, I mean, we can get into the debate if any car is IoT. They all arguably are, but an IoT car implies something slightly different than just sort of the computers that are in even a modern sedan these days. I'm thinking, right, like closer to, say, just to name a product, a Tesla is a bit more of what I would call an IoT product that's an automobile, as opposed to my mid-size Chevrolet, which sure, smart features are in there, but it doesn't get over-the-air updates, for example. I think that's sort of like an indicative of a juncture into something that's IoT. Now, when you're sitting in the Tesla, are you cognitively thinking any differently about how this device has possibly way more interactions with the digital world than my car does? And there are certain implications related to that. And as more and more people buy cars that are like that, will they think to use the password guidance on the mobile app for their car? Will they even understand how to secure authentication to their car besides the key, right? It starts to really butt up with what we understand as keeping things safe and operating the way we expect them to. And again, this is kind of based on my prior experience with my PhD work. These kinds of mental models individuals are going to have about these products are going to be very ingrained. So, a fridge is a fridge. It's going to be hard to convince people that they really need to start thinking about it much more closer to how they think about a laptop than how they think about a fridge. So yeah, there's a few, I can go through some real life cases where this has impacted some security as well. But I didn't know if we had other questions that you wanted to get into, Jennifer, before I pivoted to those slides.
Yeah, I would like to leave some time just to answer some of the questions that have been coming in. Before we do so, and while we leave the Q&A box open, maybe we can just discuss, like, what are the quick wins? Like, once this webinar is over, what can the members of the audience do right now, 5 minutes or less, to make their lives a little bit more secure?
I can transition right into that, and I'll give it right to you,
Yeah.
James, just to cut right off of my IoT discussion here, right? I would say, based on everything I just said, be aware is one big thing. Just if you're buying a product, if you're buying it and there's a smart option and you like that product, you're going to use it. Be aware that that's a smart product that comes with it some certain cybersecurity responsibility, very possibly. And then that starts to dive into, adapting as best as you can what we've said otherwise on this webinar, right? If there's a password, make it as good as you can make it based on your understanding of what we said. That's probably better than 1111111. Whatever you interpret our guidance as, based on what we've said here, given the limitations you're given on the product, you'll probably land on something that's better than just the one character over and over, or the usual passwords 1, 2, 3s, right? So that's another. So I think if you're thinking about it, you're already doing more than you could be, or a lot of people are doing. And that goes for things like being aware of updates coming in, like I mentioned, and the other advice we give an MFA, if it's available, use it. Check if it's available. Think about these things and look for these things. That's definitely the quickest win you could get, I think, in cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the only thing I would add is, mainly because Don Wallingford submitted a question about this, so I'll go ahead and answer it. We talked about your passwords, and I'm sure that's the first thing everybody's going to do if they haven't already been doing it while we're on this webinar. Is, oh, do I reuse my passwords? Most of the major browsers now, the smartphones will tell you if you have repetitive passwords, or if you have compromised passwords. If you have, I guess they all probably do now, have a little alert that says this password has been involved in this data breach or a data breach. And if you have any questions about whether or not your email has been compromised, go to I've been pwned and look it up. And it's not exhaustive, but it's pretty close, of the number of emails that have been compromised in data breaches, and it'll tell you if yours is one of them, and how many times it's been compromised, and in which events it was compromised. So it's a wake-up call if you haven't gone and looked at that. But to Don's question about freezing credit, should you do it for your children? Absolutely. Do it for yourself. Do it for your minor children, because we saw the slide earlier about the value of a social security number. Well, that's for an adult. The social security number for a child is more valuable because there's nothing attached to it. So if an identity thief can get a hold of that social security number, they have somewhere between probably 10 and 18 years to misuse that before anybody figures it out. Usually when a child gets to the point where they're applying for college is the first time most people find out that their children's identities have been compromised. And at that point, it's very difficult to unwind, because what undoubtedly happens is they have a work history and they have income that's been reported against that social security number. And they may be 16 years old and they've got 12 years of work history. So freeze your children's credit too when you freeze your own.
And we have a question in here. If you could repeat the website you mentioned that you could go to freeze your credit.
I should have looked this up ahead of time. Google I've been pwned, PWND, and I can't remember the
Oh, it was
URL.
frozen PII, was that it?
And the one for freezing credit is Frozen Pi, frozenpii.org. That's founded by a former federal prosecutor who was a victim of the OPM data breach. And lesson learned, don't mess with former federal prosecutors. So that's the credit freeze. And then if you want to find out about if your email's been compromised, it's I've been pwned, and just Google it and it'll take you to the site.
We have another question here about writing passwords down as a way to keep them safe. how do you feel about writing passwords down as a form of password management? Is that better or worse than keeping them in a password manager?
You know, I'm of two schools on that. You know, that again, that's one of those things that, you know, it was different when we literally had, you know, shoulder surfers and things like that, and people would, you know, stick their password in a sticky note on their monitor and everything. As long as you're not doing something like that and you truly keep it in a safe and secure place, you know, because so many people are working from home, or it's okay to write them down if it helps you remember it. The key is just unique passwords per account, but, you know, don't leave it out in the open. Don't, you know, do something to keep it secure. I wouldn't do it at work. It probably violates any number of work policies, but, you know, again, if it helps you to manage that without going to the point of using a password manager or using the function within your browser, then that's fine. The one thing I would say you should not do in terms of the modern browsers is they're secure, but a lot of times you go to a website and the website itself will ask, do you want to save the password? Don't do that. Don't save it to don't save the password to the website. That is risky. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a recipe for disaster, but it's at least an ingredient.
I would go further and say you should save little to websites.
Yeah.
Even credit, I'm thinking mainly of credit card information, payment information. It's convenient, but even if anything, the bigger they seem, the harder they fall, right? And so I think you have to sometimes question the security on a small website. That might be an easier one to determine, oh yeah, I'm not going to leave my credit card information on their database, right? Keep in mind, when you save it, it's saved in a database. That could be part of a breach. That's what James is really alerting to here with the saving your password. It saves as part of a session. There's more data related to it somewhere that can be part of the attack in different ways, many different ways. In this case, it's, you know, the simplest one. It's like, you know, they're going to get your username and password. That has to be saved. But if you've overshared a ton of information with this website in that breach, to the language James used, then, you know, even more bets are possibly off as the you know, they don't need to hack your email if they have your credit card, because that might be what they're looking for, right? And if the website saved a ton of information related to that card, they might have the whole gambit, your home address and all, which also again might just be attached to a lot of information is naturally attached to your accounts. Why give them more? It saves us a little bit of time to not have to type it in, right? You know, but it's probably worth your money if there is some sort of breach when the time comes, to give yourself that extra little bit of complexity there.
And unfortunately, I think we are out of time. We weren't able to get to every question, but I do just want to quickly flip through here and share one more slide. We have some, and we can send these out through our email if anybody's interested. You can contact us at info@staysafeonline.org if you have any questions, or if you're looking for other advice on cybersecurity best practices. We do also have contact information here from the Identity Theft Resource Center, some additional resources from NIST as well. So if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to staysafeonline.org. And with that, I want to thank James and Michael so much for being here and sharing your advice and expertise with us. And thank you again to Verity IT for hosting us. And thank you all so much for joining this afternoon. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.